This is a homily for the second Sunday of Easter. The first reading is from the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 4, verses 32 to 35. The second reading comes from the first letter of St. John, chapter 5, verses 1 to 6. The Gospel for this Sunday comes from the Gospel of St. John, chapter 20, verses 19 to 31. The Easter season lasts from Easter Sunday until Pentecost Sunday. So let's have a quick overview of the Gospel readings that we'll be hearing during this Easter season. On the second Sunday of Easter, the same Gospel is read in all 3 years of the liturgical cycle. We hear the story of the risen Lord appearing to his disciples who have gathered behind locked doors. However, Thomas is not with them on this occasion. When Jesus appears a second time, we have the deeply moving encounter between Christ and his doubting disciple, and the gentle but firm way in which the Lord brings Thomas to faith. Jesus then proclaims the demanding ideal of unconditional faith. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. On the third Sunday of Easter, Luke's Gospel tells us about the 2 disciples who have just returned to Jerusalem from Emmaus. They are still telling their story to the 11 and their companions when the risen Lord stands among them. The Lord shows them his hands and feet and asks if they have anything to eat. They offer him a piece of grilled fish, and he eats it before their eyes. The Gospel for the 4th Sunday of Easter always comes from chapter 10 of John's Gospel. This year we focus on the Good Shepherd who lays down his life for his sheep. We have the image of the vine and the branches on the 5th Sunday of Easter. The Lord is the vine, and we are the branches. Cut off from him, we can do nothing. The Gospel for the 6th Sunday of Easter comes from John's account of Jesus speaking with his disciples during the Last Supper. "This is my commandment," Jesus tells them, "that you should love one another as I have loved you." In Australia, we celebrate the Feast of the Ascension on the 7th Sunday of Easter. In Year B, we hear Luke's account of the Ascension from the Acts of the Apostles, and in the Gospel we have an overview of the appearances of the risen Lord taken from the later ending to Mark's Gospel. Finally, the Gospel for Pentecost Sunday comes from John's account of the risen Lord appearing to his disciples. He breathes on them and says, "Receive the Holy Spirit. For those whose sins you forgive, they are forgiven. For those whose sins you retain, they are retained." The Easter season concludes with the Feast of Pentecost. Although we are then back in what the Church's liturgical calendar calls ordinary time, the Sunday following Pentecost celebrates the Feast of the Most Holy Trinity, and the Sunday after that is the Feast of the Body and Blood of Christ. It's not until June the 9th that we return to the Sundays of ordinary time. And ordinary time continues until Sunday, December the 1st, the first Sunday of Advent, and the beginning of the new liturgical year. Today's Gospel is taken from the Gospel of John, chapter 20, verses 19 to 31. The chapter ends with these words, "Jesus did many other signs in the sight of the disciples, which are not written in this book. These are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. This sounds as though John the Evangelist is signing off, so you'd be forgiven for thinking that you've come to the end of the Gospel. But no, there is still another chapter to come. The scholarly consensus is that the final chapter of John is a postscript or epilogue to the Gospel. But it's important to note that chapter 21 is included in all of the extant manuscripts of the Gospel of John. The slightly briefer ending to chapter 21 echoes the conclusion of today's Gospel. The evangelist tells us that from the enormous amount of information available to him, he has been very selective in what he has included in his Gospel. And what criteria have guided him as he wrote his Gospel? Well, to answer that question, we need to go back to the conclusion of today's Gospel. There we find the evangelist's guiding criteria. Firstly, he tells us that he has written this Gospel so that we may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. And secondly, that by believing we may have life in his name. I'll come back to these final words in a minute, but before I do, I'd like to draw your attention to one of the key words that John uses. He tells us that there were many other signs that Jesus did in the sight of the disciples. The Greek word, translated here as sign, is semeion. John's Gospel never uses the word miracle. He prefers instead the word sign. We don't erect signs so that people will stop to admire them. Signs are erected to point us in the right direction, in the same way that we don't go to a restaurant to eat the menu. The menu is provided to inform us what food is available to order. Likewise, the miracles in John's Gospel are all signs pointing to Jesus. New Testament scholar Gail O'Day explains it this way. John uses the term sign to refer to Jesus' miracles because for John, the significance of the miracle does not rest solely in the act of the miracle itself, but in that to which the miracle points. That is, the deed reveals the doer and points to the significance of the deed. Scripture scholars often refer to the first part of John's Gospel as the book of signs. And those signs are 7 miracles. The miracle at Cana. Also at Cana, the cure of a royal official's son. A healing at the pool of Bethesda. The miracle of the loaves and fishes. Jesus walking on water. Healing the man born blind. And the raising of Lazarus from the dead. All of these miracles are signs that reveal something about Jesus himself. Later this year, beginning with the final Sunday of July, John's Gospel makes another guest appearance in this year of Mark. For 5 weeks, we will be listening to readings from chapter 6 of John's Gospel, beginning with his account of the feeding of a great multitude of people with 5 loaves and 2 fish. But unlike the 3 synoptic Gospels, John takes time to reflect on the meaning of that miracle. As we'll see in a few weeks' time, the sign is often accompanied by a discourse or narrative that brings out the symbolic meaning of the sign. But you'll have to be patient and wait until the 17th Sunday in ordinary time. Let me return to the conclusion of today's Gospel. John has written his Gospel so that we may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing we may have life in his name. Let me focus on 2 words, believe and believing. They are both translations of the Greek verb pisteuo. The verb pisteuo can be translated into English as believe, have faith in, trust in, to be convinced of, or to accept as true. The verb is pisteuo and the noun is pistis. So pistis can be translated as faith, belief, trust, confidence, or faithfulness. Either the verb or the noun appears in all three of today's readings. In the first reading from the Acts of the Apostles, we're told that the whole group of believers was of one heart and mind. Believers is a translation of the participle of the verb pisteuo. In the second reading from the first letter of St. John, we're told that this is the victory that has overcome the world, our faith. Who can overcome the world but the one who believes that Jesus is the Son of God? Faith is a translation of the Greek noun pistis, and believes is a participle of the verb pisteuo. And finally, in today's Gospel, Jesus tells Thomas, "You believe because you can see me. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe." Believe is again a translation of the verb pisteuo. Although the words believe and faith in English are different but similar, the Greek makes clear that both pisteuo and pistis mean to have faith in or to trust. Let's now turn to a detail in today's Gospel that can be easily overlooked. Thomas is called the twin. On a previous occasion, in chapter 11, verse 16, we're also told that Thomas was known as the twin. Why does John tell us that? After all, we never get to meet Thomas's twin. If, as John tells us in both of the conclusions to the Gospel, he's being very selective about what he includes in the Gospel, how is this seemingly incidental detail relevant, and why is it included? Well, the short answer is we don't know. John doesn't tell us. Of all the possible explanations that have been offered, the one that appeals to me is this. John wants the reader to ask the question, who is Thomas's twin? And the answer is me. I am Thomas's twin. And why? Because, like Thomas, I'd like some proof. If I were there with the disciples, I'd be joining Thomas in saying, unless I can see the holes that the nails made in his hands and can put my finger into the holes they made, and unless I can put my hand into his side, I refuse to believe. In other words, I want to see and touch for myself. Well, as we heard in today's Gospel, Jesus invites Thomas to do just that, to see and touch. But then he adds, blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. And again, we have here the participle of the Greek verb pisteuo. So we could translate this verse as, blessed are those who have not seen and yet have faith in me. So let's ask the question, what do we mean by faith? First of all, let's get one thing straight. Christian faith is not blind faith. Although Jesus says that people are blessed who believe without seeing, that doesn't mean that we are being asked to believe things that are absurd or irrational. Richard Dawkins, an evolutionary biologist and author of The God Delusion, speaks of faith in very disparaging terms. Faith is the great cop-out, the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence. Faith is belief in spite of, even perhaps because of, the lack of evidence. By way of response to Dawkins, I'd say that we need to make a distinction between proof and evidence. As we'll see in a moment, we believe many things in life which we cannot scientifically prove or empirically verify, but we accept them as being true on the basis of reliable evidence. To say either, I believe in God, or there is no God, are both statements of faith. I think that it demands a far greater act of faith to assert that there isn't a God than it does to believe in God. Secondly, science itself is ultimately based on faith. The English physicist Paul Davies makes this observation. Science, we are repeatedly told, is the most reliable form of knowledge about the world because it is based on testable hypotheses. Religion, by contrast, is based on faith. The problem with this neat separation is that all science proceeds on the assumption that nature is ordered in a rational and intelligible way. You couldn't be a scientist if you thought the universe was a meaningless jumble of odds and ends haphazardly juxtaposed. Clearly, then, both religion and science are founded on faith. In other words, the scientist accepts it on faith that the experiment he or she conducted today will yield identical results tomorrow if conducted under identical conditions. Matter acts according to certain laws. If it didn't, science would be impossible. Why does matter act according to certain laws? Well, it just does. I can't prove why matter acts according to these laws. I just accept it on faith. The late John Polkinghorne, an Anglican priest and formerly professor of mathematical physics at the University of Cambridge, summarizes it concisely in these words. Science requires commitment to the basic act of faith that there is a deep, rational order in the world awaiting discovery. Must we always have proof before we can believe something? Must we empirically verify and scientifically test any proposition before we can accept it as true? The scientific method demands proof. That's how it works. It's associated with words such as test, touch, see, observe, verify, measure, and examine. The scientific method begins with observation, and then by posing the question, why is it so? By way of response, the scientist forms an hypothesis. The scientist then tests the hypothesis by experimentation, before finally drawing a conclusion. Let's come back to the distinction between proof and evidence. In the course of each day, many of the decisions that we make are based on evidence rather than facts that we can empirically verify or scientifically test. For example, whenever I board an aeroplane, I make an implicit act of faith that the plane is airworthy and that the pilot and crew will get me to my destination. I make a similar act of faith whenever I board a bus or catch a taxi. I entrust my life to a medical team whenever I undergo an operation. We make hundreds of acts of faith every day without being conscious of it. Consider another example. Love is based on faith. We don't have scientific proof that another person loves us. We can't put that person's DNA under the microscope to find out if they love us. We rely rather on evidence or experience. Our legal system is based on evidence. One person accuses another of a crime. Again, we can't conduct a scientific experiment to prove whether a person is guilty or innocent by, for example, examining their DNA. DNA may be used in evidence. It may place a person at the scene of a crime, but of itself, it cannot tell us whether that person is guilty or innocent. We solve a crime by gathering evidence. The case eventually ends up in a court before a judge and jury. A court must establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, and occasionally the court gets it wrong. A guilty person is set free, or an innocent person is convicted of a crime they did not commit. So the scientific method, valuable as it is not our only means of arriving at the truth. Let's come back to the question, what is faith? Faith, like love, is an elusive reality. We use the word faith in a number of different ways. Firstly, faith often refers to what I believe. We speak of the Catholic faith, and we articulate the basic tenets of the Catholic faith whenever we recite the Creed together. But the Creed is more than a list of doctrinal propositions to which we give intellectual assent. Our English word creed comes from two Latin words, cor, meaning heart, and dare, which means to give. So, etymologically, the word creed means that to which I give my heart. It articulates a worldview which helps us to navigate our way through life. Secondly, faith is about a way of seeing, a way of looking at life. Bishop Robert Barron puts it this way: Christianity is above all a way of seeing. Everything else in Christian life flows from and circles around the transformation of vision. C.S. Lewis had this to say: I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. What we're talking about here could be described as a paradigm shift, a term coined by Thomas Kuhn in his book The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Here's one example of a paradigm shift. From at least the time of Aristotle in the 4th century BC, the prevailing paradigm for the universe was geocentric. In other words, the Earth was at the centre of our universe, and the sun, moon, stars and planets all orbited around a stationary Earth. But the geocentric paradigm was challenged, firstly by Nicholas Copernicus, and then by observations that Galileo made through a very primitive telescope. They both proposed a heliocentric universe, a universe in which the sun was at the centre. Eventually, despite initial opposition, there was a paradigm shift from an Earth-centred universe to a sun-centred universe. But what was it that changed in the 16th century? Nothing in the heavens changed. The Earth and the sun didn't swap places. What changed was in our minds, in our perception, in how we saw and interpreted what was out there. Likewise, our faith gives us a new way of seeing and interpreting our world. But faith also allows us to catch glimpses of another, brighter world. Listen to this reflection by the late English philosopher Robert Scruton. Anybody who goes through life with open mind and heart will encounter moments that are saturated with meaning, but whose meaning cannot be put into words. These moments are precious to us. When they occur, it is as though, on the winding, ill-lit stairway of our life, we suddenly come across a window through which we catch sight of another and brighter world. There are many who dismiss this world as an unscientific fiction. I am not alone in thinking it real and important. Thirdly, faith is a journey. The first encyclical letter that Pope Francis wrote once he had become Pope was called, in Latin, Lumen Fidei, or the Light of Faith in English. Pope Francis explained that Pope Benedict had almost completed a first draft of an encyclical on faith. For this I am deeply grateful to him, and, as his brother in Christ, I have taken up his fine work and added a few contributions of my own. The central idea of the encyclical lies in the word journey. The Latin words via and iter are used almost 90 times in the encyclical. Those words mean something like way, highway, road, path, or journey. They become metaphors for faith. Faith is a journey, and like all journeys, it has its ups and downs. There are moments when we want to extol the Lord, for he has raised us up and has not let our enemies rejoice over us. But there are other times when we make the words of Jesus on the cross our own. My God, why have you forsaken me? And faith, like any journey, experiences obstacles and setbacks, confusions and wrong turns. There are misunderstandings, and we get lost. Like all journeys, faith takes time, and we need directions. And faith, like many journeys, is both an outward and an inner journey. And, like all journeys, there is a destination. Finally, faith is about trust. That is, about trusting God, about letting go. Some time ago I read a contemporary parable about a rock climber who was totally exhausted after hours of strenuous climbing. Drained of all energy, he found himself hanging on for dear life to the edge of a high cliff. He began to pray. Then from a cloud he heard the voice of God. "Do you really believe in me?" As his life hung in the balance, he screamed out, "I do, I do!" God then answered, "Do you trust me?" In desperation, the man answered, "Yes, yes." Then the voice of God came back, "Then I will see to it that you are saved. Now, do what I tell you to do. Let go." One final point. Faith is not immune to doubt. In 1968, a young German theologian by the name of Josef Ratzinger published a book entitled Introduction to Christianity. Josef Ratzinger is probably better known to us as Pope Benedict XVI. In this Introduction to Christianity, Ratzinger makes the point that if we are honest to ourselves, we must acknowledge that our journey of faith is a cocktail of belief and doubt. He gives the example of Saint Therese of Lisieux, a Carmelite nun who died in 1897 at the age of 24. Ratzinger writes this about Saint Therese. That lovable Saint Teresa of Lisieux, who looked so naive and unproblematical, had grown up in an atmosphere of complete religious security. Her whole existence, from beginning to end and down to the smallest detail, was so completely moulded by the faith of the Church that the invisible world had become not just part of her everyday life, but that life itself. It seemed to be an almost tangible reality that could not be removed by any amount of thinking. To her, religion, really was a self-evident presupposition of her daily existence. She dealt with it as we deal with the concrete details of our lives. Yet this very saint, a person apparently cocooned in complete security, left behind her, from the last weeks of her passion, shattering admissions which her horrified sisters toned down in her literary remains, and which have only now come to light in the new verbatim editions. She says, for example, "I am assailed by the worst temptations of atheism. Everything has become questionable. Everything is dark." She feels tempted to take only the sheer void for granted. Ratzinger continues his reflection on faith and doubt by using a story from the Jewish Hasidic tradition, included in an anthology edited by Martin Buber, entitled Tales of the Hasidim. The story is about a self-assured adherent of the Enlightenment, a very learned man who had heard of the saintly rabbi of Berdichev. Berdichev is today in the Ukraine. He intended to visit the rabbi in order to argue with him, to shatter his religious beliefs. When he entered the rabbi's room, he found him with a book in his hand, wrapped in thought. The rabbi paid no attention to the new arrival. Suddenly the rabbi stopped, looked at the visitor fleetingly, and said, "But perhaps it is true, after all." The visitor was taken aback. His knees trembled, so terrible was the rabbi to behold, and so terrible his simple utterance to hear. But the rabbi now turned to face him and spoke quite calmly. "My son, the great scholars of the Torah with whom you have argued wasted their words on you. As you departed, you laughed at them. They were unable to lay God and his kingdom on the table before you, and nor can I. But think, my son, perhaps it is true." The exponent of the Enlightenment opposed him with all his strength, but this single word, perhaps, echoed back at him long after he had left the rabbi, and it finally broke his resistance. Ratzinger offers this reflection. In other words, both the believer and the unbeliever share, each in his own way, doubt and belief, if they do not hide away from themselves and from the truth of their being. Neither can quite escape either doubt or belief. In other words, it is the word perhaps that unites the believer and the unbeliever. I believe, perhaps I am wrong. I do not believe, perhaps I am wrong. Only fundamentalists and fanatics are uncomfortable with a journey peppered with perhaps. The rabbi was able to confront his own doubts and insecurities. The adherent of the Enlightenment was so secure in his own worldview that he was unable to entertain the possibility that he might be wrong. The Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky once said, "My hosannas have been forged in the crucible of doubt." Thomas, in today's Gospel, becomes one of the heroes of the Gospel, especially for those who have to wrestle and struggle for faith. As much as we might like to see and touch like Thomas, the words of the Lord in today's Gospel are directed to us. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe.